Welcome to the D.E.A.D podcast, where I discuss all things spooky and weird. I'm Desi, and today I'll be talking about A Nightmare on Elm Street. Let's get started. Hey everyone, how is everyone doing? Hope y'all are doing good. I am not drinking an alcoholic beverage because it is 12 o'clock on a Sunday. I normally record at night. So that's why I normally have alcoholic drink. But today I decided to record early since I had some time and it is barely 12 o'clock. So it was still morning when I was getting ready. So I just have a big glass of water. That's what I have. But I am wearing a spooky shirt. And of course, for this episode, I am wearing my A Nightmare on Elm Street Freddy Krueger t shirt, which I love. It is one of my favorites. And we're going to get right into it because I have a lot of what I want to discuss. Let's get going. Okay, so Wes Craven is probably the most prolific horror director of all time. After all, you don't get any bigger than the horror franchise that is A Nightmare on Elm Street. However, that wasn't always the case. Wes Craven had just come off of the now horror successes Last House on the Left and The Hills Have Eyes, which were far from hits back then. He had spent the next 3 years after this without a single paycheck, lost his house and his wife, and had fallen into heavy drug use. When he finally cleaned up his act, he began writing the film that would change his career and Hollywood's perception of the boogeyman. But his lack of financial success would make for a tough time getting a studio to make A Nightmare on Elm Street. The idea came to him when he was reading an article in the LA Times about a family who had escaped the killing fields in Cambodia and managed to get to the US. Everything was fine until the young son started experiencing terrifying nightmares. He was too afraid to sleep for fear of being attacked in his dreams and never waking up again. Sound familiar? In his vivid visions, the boy was being chased. When he finally fell asleep, his parents thought the crisis was over. But then they heard screams in the middle of the night. By the time they got to him, he was dead. He died in the middle of a nightmare. Here was a kid having a vision of a horror that everyone older was denying. That became the central line of A Nightmare on Elm Street. However, the boy's death was not an isolated incident. Dozens of Southeast Asian refugees in America died for unknown reasons in their sleep during the 1980s. Having fled genocide in Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam for a new life in America, many began suffering from extremely violent, potentially PTSD related nightmares. The mysterious deaths were usually among young men in their 20s or 30s and affected a large enough segment of this population to alarm public health experts. The authorities dubbed this Asian death syndrome, which was thought to be some form of sudden death syndrome, or maybe Brugada syndrome, which affects the heart's rhythm. Today, it is known as unexpected nocturnal death syndrome, though medical research has yet to provide a single adequate explanation for these deaths. Now, I want to go into the history of what these people that came here were suffering in Cambodia, really what they went through over there, that maybe will shed some light on what they could have been experiencing that would have caused them to have these terrifying nightmares, terrifying deadly nightmares. The people suffering from this puzzling ailment were typically refugees from Laos, a small landlocked country in Southeast Asia. The Hmong minority group had been persecuted in Laos after they were recruited by the CIA to fight North Vietnamese soldiers during the Vietnam War. More than 30,000 Hmong soldiers helped us fight communism in the Northern Highlands, where they lived but died at a rate 10 times higher than their American counterparts. In 1975, the Vietnam War ended and Laos became a communist country. The new leadership there viewed the Hmong as traitors for their work with the United States. The Khmer Rouge was a brutal regime that ruled Cambodia under the leadership of dictator Pol Pot. From 1975 to 1979, Pol Pot's attempt to create a Cambodian master race through social engineering ultimately led to the deaths of more than 2 million people in the Southeast Asian country. Those killed were either executed as enemies of the regime or died from starvation, disease, or being overworked. Historically, this time period has become known as the Cambodian Genocide. Although Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge didn't come to power until the mid-70s, the roots of their takeover can be traced to the 60s, when a communist insurgency first became active in Cambodia, which was then ruled by a monarch. Throughout the 1960s, Khmer Rouge operated as the armed wing of the Communist Party of Kampuchea, the name the party used for Cambodia, operating primarily in remote jungle and mountain areas in the northeast of the country near its border with Vietnam, which at the time was embroiled in its own civil war. The Khmer Rouge did not have popular support across Cambodia, particularly in the cities. For the next 5 years, a civil war between the right-leaning military and those supporting the alliance of Prince Norodom and the Khmer Rouge raged in Cambodia. Eventually, the Khmer Rouge side seized the advantage in the conflict after gaining control of increasing amounts of territory in the Cambodian countryside. In 1975, Khmer Rouge fighters invaded Phnom Penh and took over the city. With the capital in its grasp, the Khmer Rouge had won the civil war and thus ruled the country. The Khmer Rouge opted to hand the power over to the leader of the Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot. As a leader during its days as an insurgent movement, Pol Pot came to admire the tribes in Cambodia's rural northeast. These tribes were self-sufficient and lived on the goods they produced through subsistence farming. The tribes, he felt, were like communes in that they worked together, shared in the spoils of their labor, and were untainted by the evils of money, wealth, and religion, the latter being the Buddhism common in Cambodia's cities. Once installed as the country's leader by the Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot and the forces loyal to him quickly set about remaking Cambodia, which they had renamed Kampuchea, in the model of these rural tribes with the hopes of creating a communist-style agricultural utopia. Declaring 1975 Year Zero in the country, Pol Pot isolated Kampuchea from the global community. He resettled hundreds of thousands of the country's city dwellers in rural farming communes and abolished the country's currency. He also outlawed the ownership of private property and the practice of religion in the new nation. Workers on the farm collectives established by Pol Pot soon began suffering from the effects of being overworked and the lack of food. Hundreds of thousands died from disease, starvation, or damage to their bodies sustained during back-breaking work, or abuse from the ruthless Khmer Rouge guards overseeing the camps. Pol Pot's regime also executed thousands of people it had deemed as enemies of the state. Those seen as intellectuals or potential leaders of the revolutionary movement were also executed. Legend has it some were executed for merely appearing to be intellectuals by wearing glasses or being able to speak a foreign language. As part of this effort, hundreds of thousands of the educated middle-class Cambodians were tortured and executed in special centers established in the cities, the most infamous of which was Tuol Sleng Jail in Phnom Penh, where nearly 17,000 men, women, and children were imprisoned during the regime's 4 years in power. During what became known as the Cambodian Genocide, an estimated 1.7 to 2.2 million Cambodians died during Pol Pot's time in charge of the country. The Vietnamese invaded Cambodia in 1979, and removed Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge from power after a series of violent battles on the border between the two countries. Pol Pot had sought to extend his influence in the newly unified Vietnam, but his forces were quickly rebuffed. After the invasion, Pol Pot and his Khmer Rouge fighters quickly retreated to remote areas of the country. However, they remained active as an insurgency, but with declining influence. Vietnam retained control in the country, with a military presence for much of the 1980s over the objections of the United States. Many survivors from the war fled their homes to become refugees in Thailand or the US. The group's troubles did not end with resettlements, as they often remained traumatized by their experiences back home. Hmong refugees in the US suffered from high rates of poverty, and soon that's when the mysterious ailment seemed to befall them. Just like Freddy Krueger's targets in A Nightmare on Elm Street, many of the afflicted were teenagers and young men. Headlines such as "Mysterious Striking Hmong Men" and "Night Deaths of Asian Men Unexplained" ran in the LA Times throughout the 1970s and early 1980s. One 1981 article describes the scene of a Laotian refugee who relocated to the US from a refugee camp in Thailand with his family. But shortly after settling in his new country, 47-year-old Yong Lang Tao died in his sleep with his wife beside him, in tears. He was the fourth Hmong man to die while sleeping in 9 months and the 13th nocturnal Hmong death recorded since 1978. According to the article, even though investigators could find no medical explanation for the deaths, many community members attributed the deaths to chemical nerve agents that refugee soldiers of the Vietnam War would have been exposed to. That theory was not supported by doctors, however. Other Hmong believed they were being punished by the spirits of their ancestors for leaving their homeland. The threat of this mysterious death sentence given to Hmong refugees may be even more frightening than the fictional serial murderer that it inspired. I'll say it's definitely more frightening than some creepy dude in your dreams. I think, what they went through over there was so traumatic for those who did survive. And then to come here and be able to think that things are going to get better and then to have this happen is just, it's so, so incredibly sad. I personally think it was just too much on them, especially the young men who, they probably overworked harder than any of them because, they were young, and they tortured them during the vital years of their young life, that it affected them so much mentally. And I think the dreams were them thinking that this Pol Pot and the whole, Khmer Rouge army was going to come back to get them, and, after they thought they were safe in our country. And I think maybe it was just too much stress on their bodies that it gave out. So that's just my thought on that. And so that's a little more in depth than, oh, Wes Craven read an article about someone dying in their sleep. There was more to it than that, and I really wanted to tell that story. Dive a little deeper. I mean, I'm sure there's more to it, but so now I'm going to get into the movie, and I'm going to read the synopsis of A Nightmare on Elm Street. Teenager Tina Gray awakens from a terrifying nightmare in which a disfigured man wearing a blade-fixed glove attacks her in a boiler room. Her mother points out 4 mysterious slashes on her nightgown. The following morning, Tina's best friend, Nancy Thompson, and Nancy's boyfriend, Glenn Lance, console her, revealing that they each also had a nightmare the previous night. The two stay at Tina's house when Tina's mother goes out of town, where Nancy also confesses to having a nightmare about the disfigured man. Tina's boyfriend, Rod Lane, interrupts their sleepover. When Tina falls asleep, she dreams of the disfigured man chasing her. Rod is awakened by Tina's thrashing and sees her being dragged and fatally slashed by an unseen force, forcing him to flee as Nancy and Glenn awaken to find Tina bloodied and dead. The next day, Nancy's policeman father, Don Thompson, arrests Rod despite his pleas of innocence. At school, Nancy falls asleep in class and dreams that the man chases her to the boiler room, where she is cornered. She then deliberately burns her arm on a pipe. The burn startles her awake in class, and she notices a burn mark on her arm. Nancy visits Rod at the police station, where he describes Tina's death along with his own recent nightmares about the same man stalking her in her dreams, leading Nancy to believe that the man killed Tina. At home, Nancy falls asleep in the bathtub and is nearly drowned by the man. Nancy then relies on caffeine to stay awake and invites Glenn to watch over her as she sleeps. In her dream, Nancy sees a man preparing to kill Rod in his cell, but then he turns his attention towards her. Nancy runs away and wakes up when her alarm clock goes off. The man kills Rod by wrapping bed sheets around his neck, staging it as a suicide by hanging. At Rod's funeral, Nancy's parents become worried when she describes her dreams. Her mother, Marge, takes her to a sleep disorder clinic where, in a dream, Nancy grabs the man's fedora with the name Fred Krueger written in it and pulls it into the real world. After barricading the house, Marge explains that Krueger was an insane child murderer who killed 20 children but was released on a technicality and then burned alive by the victims' parents who lived on their street, seeking vigilante justice. Nancy realizes that Krueger, now a vengeful ghost, is killing her and her friends out of revenge and to satiate his psychopathic needs. Nancy tries to call Glenn to warn him, but his father prevents her from speaking to him. Glenn falls asleep and is killed by Krueger. Now, alone, Nancy puts Marge to sleep and asks Dawn, who is across the street investigating Glenn's death, to break into the house in 20 minutes. Nancy rigs booby traps around the house and grabs Krueger out of the dream and into the real world. The booby traps affect Krueger enough that Nancy can light him on fire and lock him in the basement. And Nancy rushes to the door for help. The police arrive to find Krueger has escaped the basement. Nancy and Dawn go upstairs to find a burning Krueger smothering Marge in her bedroom. After Dawn extinguishes the fire, Krueger and Marge vanish into the bed. When Dawn leaves the room, Krueger rises from the bed behind Nancy. Realizing that Krueger is fueled by his victim's fear, she calmly turns her back to him. Krueger evaporates when he attempts to lunge at her. Nancy steps outside into a bright and foggy morning where all her friends and her mother are still alive. Nancy gets into Glenn's convertible to go to school when the green and red striped top suddenly comes down and locks them in as the car drives uncontrollably down the street. Three girls in white dresses playing jump rope can be heard chanting Krueger's nursery rhyme as Marge is grabbed by. So I absolutely love this movie. Out of all the, 80s movies, Friday the 13th, Halloween, and all that, Freddy is my absolute favorite. Now, of course, it's not the scariest thing ever, but just like the concept, especially for that time, is great. The nightmares, the boogeyman coming to get you in your dreams, and then being able to pull him out of your dreams into reality is just so crazy. And then, of course, the knives thing. Very Edward Scissorhands, which, of course, leads me to my next favorite thing about this movie, Johnny Depp's movie debut. Johnny Depp is my absolute favorite actor in the whole wide world. I have loved him since the very beginning. I've probably seen most of the things he's been in. I even found a DVD of the first season of 21 Jump Street, which he did. So I loved him in this movie. Even Wes Craven's daughter thought that he was so hot and told her dad to pick him to play Glenn after seeing his photograph. And of course, he listened. And the last thing I love about this movie is the nursery rhyme. Now, we all know this nursery rhyme, but if you don't, it goes something like this: 1, 2, Freddy's coming for you. 3, 4, better lock your door. 5, 6, grab a crucifix. 7, 8, gonna stay up late. 9, 10, never sleep again. With creepy little girls jumping rope and scary music playing in the background, of course. So extra creepy. Now, this is the most recognizable elements of A Nightmare on Elm Street that indicates Freddy Krueger's arrival. The rhyme is first heard when Nancy and Tina are walking to school, and again in the final shot of the film. The song is sung by a group of young girls playing jump rope, and while the movie never reveals who they are, it is commonly accepted they are victims of Freddy's. Wes Craven wrote the lyrics to this song, which was taken from another nursery rhyme called 1, 2, Buckle My Shoe. But it was Heather Langenkamp's musician boyfriend who worked out the theme on the piano. A Nightmare on Elm Street's composer, Charles Bernstein, would later sprinkle this melody throughout his score as a unifying theme. It has since become a haunting piece of A Nightmare on Elm Street, and fans know when it is heard that bad things are about to happen. Now, here is just like a few more fun trivia facts about the movie. Freddy Krueger actually has less than 7 minutes of screen time. They used over 500 gallons of fake blood during filming. Robert Englund cut himself the first time when he tried on the infamous Freddy glove. Yeah, all those knives, I would cut myself too. New Line Cinema was actually saved from bankruptcy by the success of this film and was jokingly named the house that Freddy built. Craven chose to make Krueger's sweater red and green after reading an article. He's been reading a lot of articles for this movie. In a 1982 Scientific American that said these two colors were the most clashing colors to the human retina. All of the boiler room footage in the film was actually shot in the basement of the Lincoln Heights jail in Los Angeles, which was condemned shortly after production wrapped due to high levels of asbestos. The scene where Freddy's arms elongate were achieved by having men with fishing poles on each side of the alley operating a set of puppet arms attached to Robert Englund. Craven named Freddy Krueger after he had been bullied at school by a child named Fred Krueger. I wonder where that kid is now. The scene where Freddy is set on fire, chases Nancy to the top of the stairs, falls back down, and then starts back up again was all shot in one take, with several cameras, and was the most elaborate fire scene ever filmed up to that time. Stuntman Anthony Caesar was supposed to only run up the stairs, then lay down and be extinguished, but he decided to improvise the falling and run back up again. He won Best Stunt of the Year for this scene. Craven wanted to make Krueger different from all the other horror villains of the era. He wanted his villain to have a mask but be able to talk and taunt and threaten. So that's when he thought about him being burned and scarred. He also wanted him to use something less common than, running around with a butcher knife the whole time. So that's when he thought about a glove with steak knives. In the original script, the movie ended happily. Nancy kills Krueger by ceasing to believe in him, then awakens to discover that everything that happened in the movie was an elongated nightmare. She then says goodbye to her mother and drives to school with her friends. But Robert Shea wanted a twisted ending that would leave the way open for sequels. He suggested fooling the audience into thinking Krueger has been defeated, only to reveal the final scene is actually a nightmare. And then end the film with Freddy driving the car away from the house and the kids screaming. Wes Craven hated this ending. Ultimately, 4 endings were filmed: Craven's happy ending, Shay's Freddy ending, and 2 versions of a compromise ending Craven and Shay had been reached, in which Nancy's mother is pulled back into the house, but the audience is left slightly uncertain as to what is going on. Craven has always maintained that the film should have had the happy ending he originally wrote, which I agree. It was his movie. He should have got his ending. I hope y'all enjoyed going a little deeper into the making of A Nightmare on Elm Street and going into what Wes Craven, his thought process was, how he got to A Nightmare on Elm Street, and a little more of a deep dive into the article, the people behind the article that he read and what they were going through at the time. Hope y'all enjoyed it. Let me know. So that brings me to the end of this episode. Thanks for listening to the D.E.A.D podcast. Please follow me on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at the D.E.A.D podcast. Also, feel free to send in your stories, episode suggestions, or feedback at the deadpodcast1 at gmail.com, or send me a DM on Instagram. If you enjoyed this show, please rate and review the podcast on whatever platform you're listening on, and be sure to come back next week for my next episode.